Hello and welcome to an episode of Let's Get Fiscal, a chance to talk about all things related to budget and finances here in Charles County. As always, we are joined by Fiscal and Administrative Services, Jake Dyer. Jake, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And we have a special guest today, Steve Andritz from Charles County Public Schools. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
I know Jake has been really excited that you were going to be here, and I'm getting a giggle out of for those of you that can see us, our matching outfits today.
Yes, yeah. Steve got the memo that we needed to wear striped shirts. Unfortunately, I don't think Doria got the memo.
I did not get the memo. I'm sorry. But I do. To me, it looks like you guys are like on the same page already. Yeah? This is teamwork?
Oh, yeah. Steve and I have worked together for 16 years now at Charles County Public Schools, working with the CIP side.
That's awesome. So, Steve, I know originally you were with Charles County government, yeah?
Yeah, I started my career here and was here for 9.5 years.
And then you ditched us.
Yeah, and transitioned to the school board.
I like how I say ditched and you say transition. That was much more politically correct. I like that.
Been there for just about 16 years now.
And your title there is the Director of Planning and Construction?
That's correct.
What does that mean?
Well, the planning and construction is a department that obviously covers all those responsibilities for the school system, whether it be the early stages of capital projects and planning or the actual construction phases and oversight of that work. But it also is involved with our educational facilities master plan, which is more documentation required to be submitted to the state. That is more of a 10-year plan of what we are going to do, but also inventory of our schools, description on our enrollment and our projections, coordinated efforts of information from county government on growth and development. So all of those factors go in there. Also, I am jointly responsible for redistricting as well. So that's another one of the things that falls under my purview.
You have a lot going on there, yeah?
A little bit.
All right. So before we dive into the work that you do that you just described, Jake, you had this great suggestion of let's get Steve on a Let's Get Fiscal episode.
Yes.
Why?
Well, because I think it's very important and I'm hoping to learn some things from Steve today as well, because when we do the capital improvement program that's related to the school system, there's a lot of activities, a lot of work that Steve does before it gets to the county government that I think it'd be really good for the public to learn about how Steve gets, there's always state funding related to projects, so we can learn how he gets his funding from the state. He can also learn about his process on how they determine what projects should go forward and so forth. So I think it'd be really good for the public to learn with that. And then once Steve explains his process, then I can certainly explain the process we do on the county fiscal side on how to provide funding to the school system.
Awesome. So I know we've touched on capital projects in a couple of our other episodes, but if somebody is tuning in for the first time or needs a refresher, can you do some kind of definitions for us?
Yes.
So capital improvement means?
Capital improvement is essentially your really large projects, infrastructure project. That includes new schools, replacement schools, major renovations that go and forth that we would typically receive either state funding, we would bond finance or use local funds to support. And that there is a school system side, which is usually your largest capital improvement share of the pie, but there's also transportation, parks, and government infrastructure that go into it.
So that leads to my next question about kind of definitions and explaining. So we are county government. Steve is not,
yes,
but we work together. Can you give just kind of that quick overview without getting into the details? Why are you and Steve connected? Why is Steve a part of today's podcast?
Because Steve is the subject matter expert on knowing what projects need to go forward on the school system side. They manage it. They do everything. All we really do on the fiscal side, on the county side, is we reimburse the school system on the local share of the cost. And then once we know the cost of the local share of projects, we receive bond funding or use local funding to pay those bills, which is interesting that someone might not know is the local share of these projects are not embedded in the school's operating budget. It's actually embedded in the county government operating budget.
Just to really confuse people, right? So there's county government, there's the school system. I always like to talk about the library, the sheriff's office, like these different partner agencies where they govern themselves, but the money comes from county government.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on that note, Steve.
Well, can I jump in on
Yeah,
one thing?
please, of course.
When we talk about capital projects, also from the state perspective, the projects that Jake mentioned are absolutely the kind of projects you would see, but you can also have capital improvement projects that may be a roof replacement
Okay.
or a window replacement or a major HVAC upgrade at a school. All of those are eligible as capital projects.
So not
well.
as exciting as when we hear like new school, but
Right.
still super important.
Absolutely, hugely
Yeah.
important, especially when you think about the age of schools across the state and the age of schools in Charles County. Your average age of most schools in Charles County is just under 30 years old. And so when you factor in, the systems that need replacing, your roof, your HVAC, your lighting, your windows, things like that, having those be able to be replaced in a timely fashion are really important, because you can't get to that full replacement, that renovation, that new building, whatever it is, in a timely manner because of all the needs across the state and the other needs in Charles County. So sometimes you will have a building that has been in service for 50 plus years before it gets a full renovation. So those systems are really important as well. And so coordinated efforts with us and county government, with Jake, about projects really make a big difference on keeping up the quality of the facilities that we have.
Well, that just makes common sense and sounds fiscally responsible, right? That like rather than tearing my whole house down just because it needs a new roof, let's replace the roof, and then that gets me so many more years of, and same with our schools, yeah?
Absolutely.
Beautiful. All right, so Steve, tell us about the work you do and the process involved in these projects, whether it's new school, renovated school,
Sure.
or that roof and window repair,
Sure.
HVAC repair.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, the first step is driven actually by our Educational Facilities Master Plan, which is a document that we're mandated to submit by the IAC. The IAC is the Interagency Commission on School Construction.
Okay.
It is our governing state body that we coordinate everything through. So the Educational Facilities Master Plan lays out sort of our 10-year plan. And from that, we then take and build the 5-year CIP. So we submit in early October to the state for the CIP, to the IAC, and then usually by mid-October to the county for the CIP. The state really, it's a 5-year CIP submission on both sides, but the state generally focuses just on that first year.
Okay.
The county, on the other hand, will look at that 5 years and really try to factor in those other years and lock down where we're going to be.
Because we're going to need that money
Absolutely.
coming up. Okay.
Absolutely. There's also significant coordination that happens between Jake and myself, because there are steps that the county has to take to support projects to demonstrate that support. It's required in the CIP through a letter of support. But we also know that if there's a project that the state isn't going to fund, the money doesn't necessarily need to be allocated in a current fiscal year if it's not going to be supported by the state. So we work to adjust those things. But maybe we need to save a little bit of money in there because we've got to, let's say, potentially replace a playground in an elementary school ahead of an addition we're going to do. So we'll have a coordinated discussion about, okay, we can push the money back, but we still need to hold about $200,000 to replace a piece of playground equipment. So we have continued discussion from early October all the way through till May about CIP, about the projects, about what we're doing because of all those factors and how things change over time with the state. Now, when we start talking about CIP, the board policy requires us to actually go to 2 meetings.
Okay.
We have to do a report item, which usually happens in August, and then an action item, which happens in September. So the board actually has to officially approve the CIP, and that's what they do with the action item in September. And that is important because the submission date, as I mentioned, is usually the beginning of October, around the 4th of October usually, but it can shift a day or two depending on the calendar. The CIP really demonstrates the needs of the school system. It doesn't always demonstrate what we're going to get funded for. So as an example, this year's request was 14 projects, which are a mix of construction on existing, balance of funding for construction of existing projects, T.C. Martin renovation, Elementary 23, the new building that's going up. It's also money to support projects where we're putting on kindergarten additions and also trying to incorporate some additional pre-K space to meet the blueprint. And some of those things are planning requests. So in order for a project, any project at the state level that adds capacity, you have to get a planning approval first. So there are several projects that are planning approvals, including the new middle school that we're working towards being able to start. So we submitted 14 projects with a total of $28 million of construction funding.
Okay.
The state does a 10-year average number so that everybody knows roughly what you can expect. And the 10-year average number is based on $280 million available across the state for all 24 LEAs. LEA is a local educational authority. They say that instead of counties because you have Baltimore City and you also have Maryland School for the Blind.
But it pretty much means
yes.
When we hear LEA, our LEA is Charles County.
That's correct.
Okay.
In this case, yes. So assuming $280 million, Charles County's share based on that 10-year average number is $9.1 million, a little bit more.
Okay.
And so as you see, if that's all we're going to get, and our request is $28 million, we're never going to get fully fulfilled with our
Right.
request. But what's really important is to demonstrate through the CIP request the needs that we have, because we always want the state to realize that we are a growing county. We still have growth. We need these items to deal with our aging infrastructure, our aging schools, but also to deal with that new capacity for new schools or full renovations that add capacity. So that's kind of a quick overview of how we get to where we are.
So if I understand correctly, it sounds like you and your team, and I'm picturing like the number of different projects, from the playground to the new building to the roof to the HVAC to you and your team say, this is what we think. You show it to the board, and the board says, we agree, we don't agree. And as soon as they agree, you go to the state and you really try to sell this to the state. Charles County needs this money. Is that an accurate lineup so far? This is why you should support Charles County?
Yes. So we submit it to the board, and the board generally is a, yes, we agree with it, and it's approved. And it's not a, well, we want to change this or whatever. They have that ability, but that is not usually how things happen. And the reason it's important that they kind of are agreeing with our projects and our priorities is because the document has to be submitted by October 4th.
So we don't have a lot of time to go back and forth.
Yeah, and the document in itself is usually close to 200 pages worth of information. So it's not, it can be adjusted, but a complete redo is
Would not.
right.
But typically there's enough relationship, there's enough trust
Absolutely.
that when you say
Yep.
this is what I think,
Yep.
it's the board is
Yep.
just signing off on that.
And,
Okay.
and generally, it's following what we've laid out in our educational facilities master
So
plan.
not a lot of surprises.
You're right. The thing that could change is if you have a priority change. For example, maybe we had a roof replacement at a certain elementary school as highest priority, but because of all the work orders that happened last year, because of leak issues and deterioration of that roof, that you have to switch this middle school for that elementary school. So that's
The
something that could
priorities
happen.
might
Sure,
change, but
absolutely.
there's not going to be anything shocking new that comes in.
No,
hopefully.
there shouldn't be. The caveat I would say to that is we never know what kind of new programs are going to be put out there that we have to comply with. For example, I mentioned Blueprint. Blueprint has several really large components. The biggest one is full-day pre-K. And so the mandates of that and mandates of things like that from the state will force us to do additional projects that wouldn't have been on our outlook before.
And just to clarify for our listeners and audience who might not know, Blueprint is a state-mandated plan for Maryland schools. So
Yes.
Charles County can't say, no, thank you. We're not into that right now.
No.
That is Maryland saying you will do this in this timeline.
Yes, and there
Okay.
are 6 tiers, and they touch all kinds of different things. The biggest impact right now is related to pre-K, as I mentioned, all-day pre-K. But there are also impacts to career and technology, CTE, and the programs offered and how many they're offered and where they're offered. There's stuff in there about teacher pay and other things that don't relate to CIP. But
Right.
it's a very broad, touching a lot of areas kind of legislation that was put in place and has significant implications on the budget side, not
Right.
just the capital side.
We might need to have a whole other episode on the Blueprint. All right, so we've got kind of where we are so far with this is how Steve gets it up to the state.
Sure.
And then, Jake, is it your turn to jump in yet?
Well,
I feel like you're like, come on, I have things
Yeah.
to say, I have things to say.
Well, there's one thing I think I would like, if Steve, you don't mind touching base on before we turn to
Yeah.
meetings. Can you maybe explain to the general public the process you go to show that a new school or
Sure.
a new middle school
Yep.
or a school needs additional capacity? Because I know
Sure.
there's a process you have to do to demonstrate that to say that yes, we need another school. New
It's not
school.
just a fun, like,
Yeah.
I think it would look cute on that corner.
Right. So
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and so part of the process when we submit to the state in October is it goes through a review with them, and then they will put out their first decisions in December.
Okay.
But during that process, in between submission and that December deadline, they're going through and digging through all of your documentation to see, do you support what you're asking for? So if we took the example of a new school, we have to demonstrate to them that we are already meeting a certain criteria with that. So as an example, if you're going to ask for, just for simple numbers, an 800-seat elementary school, you have to show that the adjacent schools, so if you imagine a dot on the map of where the new school is going to be, and the zones all the way around it would be your adjacent schools, those adjacent schools already have to be over capacity.
Okay.
You have to show that you already have a majority of the students to fill that school already existing.
Okay.
So in theory, 51% of, so 402 kids already need to be there. So you already have to be overcrowded. It's a systemic it's a systemic
watching
way
your
that the
face,
state
yeah.
has set up the process to ensure that their funds are spent and not laying around.
Right.
So they want to know that you already have the need. And so ideally, we'd love for it to be a situation where we can get in front of it, but a lot of times we're having to deal with it a little more on the back end because we already have to be overcrowded.
And I appreciate your tactful, I laughed when I said the way your face is looking, your tactful choice of words. I assume this is because one of the big complaints you get is, why is this school so crowded before you plan
Sure.
another one? And the answer
Yep.
is because
Yep.
the state requires
Yes.
it. Okay.
Yeah, and the other part to that is the state will also mandate us that they want to see within 7 years of opening, we can demonstrate through our enrollment projections that we're going to fill that school.
Okay.
So that's important too, because if you think about the size of schools, we traditionally build for a high school 1,600 seats. That's
Okay.
where we would like a high school to be. And if you demonstrate that you have the overcapacity, but in that 7-year projection, you only demonstrate a 1,300 seat school,
Not good
the
enough.
state's not going to fund 1,600. They're only going to want to fund to 1,300.
Interesting.
The state is also really pushing that they're trying to make sure that we build what we need and not overbuild,
Okay.
which is something we're always concerned with, because in the end, we have to then heat it, cool it, maintain it, all that, which all goes into our budget request for our operating budget to pay for
Right.
all those things. So we don't want to build more than we need. We also don't want to be shorted and not be able to support the programs that we're
Right.
trying to demonstrate or trying to use, because each LEA does have the authority to do differences in their programming. So they still have to do all the core things that you have to do. But Charles County, as an example, is one of a few jurisdictions that actually supports 3 music curriculum classes at the elementary level. Most jurisdictions do not. So we have that flexibility. We're able to do that, but we know that we're not going to get supported from the state for 3 music classrooms. It's not going to happen. So we figured out how to be flexible with what we do to support 2, and then create opportunities in other spaces to allow that 3rd class to happen.
That makes sense. So the state, and this is all starting to make sense in my head, so I hope it's making sense for our listeners and viewers too. So the state is going to pay for a chunk, but it's kind of like saying, like, this is what we're willing to pay for your vacation, but if you want any add-ons, you're going to have to find
Sure.
money for that. Mom
Yeah.
and Dad will fund this much, but if you want to go snorkeling on the cruise too, that's an additional fee.
Well, and I think the point that, to clarify that, is the state will participate based in what's the bricks and mortar of the actual building.
Okay.
So the other thing is the state, how much they participate is based on your cost share, your local cost share, which is a coordinated discussion between the county and the state of a number of factors to demonstrate your relative wealth and debt affordability and other
Right.
things. So as an example, the last couple years, our state share has been 65% from the state, 35% from the local. Well, this year it changed. It dropped to 64% from the state, which meant it went up to 36% from the local. May not sound like a big deal, but if you're not planning for it, and if we're not having that discussion, that 1% could be a huge change.
And that's where you and Jake, again, it's that connection piece
Absolutely.
of,
Right.
you know, your request to the
Right.
is going to change based off
Right.
of what the state is willing to do. Okay.
So they pay for that percentage of the bricks and mortar. They also have recently instituted the ability for some money that can go towards a little bit towards design and a little bit towards FF&E. FF&E is a term we use which stands for furniture, fixtures, and equipment.
Okay.
So they give you that as a lump sum pot, but we take that and put it towards construction because we're fully supported for our design and our FF&E through the county. So we don't have to do that. It just helps with doing the construction, which means we don't have to ask these guys for more money if we need it for construction. It all kind of levels out. if
That makes
makes
it all
sense.
goes to the school, which
Yeah.
is important. Okay. Gotcha.
Right, and one more factor to put in when you talk about the state. As I mentioned, when they're reviewing your paperwork and they're going through your justifications, if they're looking at your new school and they say, well, we don't think you support this, but you want to build above and beyond, you're eligible to do that. It's just at 100% local expense.
Right.
So if in the example I had of the 800 seat elementary school, if the state says, well, we think you only justify 750 and that's all we're going to do, if we as Charles County decide we're doing 800, that extra 50 seats worth of capacity is 100% on the local. And so there's discussion about that and what are we doing and how does that work and is that within the realm of what we're able to afford and all that. So again, back with that coordinated discussion that we have.
Right. That makes sense. All right, Jake, jump in because I feel like, again, I'm watching your face.
Well, I'm glad Steve explained
Yeah.
that because I think it was good for our audience. But when Steve also mentioned there was a letter of support. So there is a letter of support that our Board of County Commissioners provide to the IAC that we typically do in November. Once Steve submits his documents to the state, he submits his documents to the locals, then we're going through and doing an analysis because as Steve mentioned, there's a local share of construction costs. We're making sure to checking to see if our local share is affordable. So we're looking at Steve's request, making sure we can afford it. It's in our 5-year plan. Typically what happens is Steve's request for the upcoming year kind of matches what the commissioners approved in their prior 5-year plan. So it's an easy process.
And no surprises because you guys are working together and
Yes.
communicating all the time.
Yeah. So once we determine if our 35% share is affordable, as well as the 100% local cost that goes into a project that Steve mentioned is ineligible, then we work with the commissioners, show the commissioners in November, and we draft a letter of support. And, there's a letter of support that outlines the school system request, totals all up, and then the commissioners review, have an opportunity to change it if they choose to. Thankfully, the last few years, they have not. They've always gone along with the school system's priorities.
Good partnership.
Good partnership. And then once that's approved, they sign the letter and we submit it to the state, to the IAC to show our local support. Because that's important because the state wants to ensure that if they're funding 65% of the cost, that the counties are willing to pay for the remaining costs.
That makes sense
Yes.
because the state's not going to put money up for a project that's not going to get finished if the county doesn't agree with it.
And then on the flip side, we're not going to put up our 35.
Right. If we know the state isn't going to match because nobody
Right.
wants a half finished or half done or half funded thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
and again, that's that coordination that we have all through the different steps of the CIP process with the state, with the IEC, because even though the letter may say, yes, we agree to support all 14 of these projects, if the state comes forward and ultimately says we're only going to fund 3, that doesn't mean the county's got to fund all 14. It doesn't make sense. There's not a reason to tie that money up. There may be a reason to tie up a little bit or none, depending on whatever's happening with that state support.
Yeah, so once we know what the state is, because thankfully, like in December, the state will put out preliminary numbers, and every month or so, every couple months, they provide updated numbers. So we're working with those updated numbers through our internal process to figure out what our priorities are, because Steve is also his projects are competing against county government managed projects.
Of course,
So
right? Everybody's competing in the budget.
Right.
We all want the money.
Right, because all these projects are backed by the general fund, and therefore we have to make sure our general fund projects can be funded by our current revenues.
And I'm glad you just added in that piece. So I'm just going to quickly ask, do a quick general fund means, because in case somebody doesn't know, general fund means.
General fund is our major operating fund in county government. That's really your fund that's supported by taxes. That's your property taxes.
So money comes in pretty
income
clearly,
taxes.
and
Yes.
that money can go back out, but it's not. There isn't magic money that shows up somewhere.
Right. Yeah, we
Okay.
do we have a 5-year model that determines what we can afford of our project. We have a debt affordability model that says at the max 8% of our debt service of our budget can be related to debt service.
That makes sense.
So we go through a huge model to make sure they're affordable. And then there are times where we work with Steve as well as our project managers, say, hey, it seems like we're having a tough year in this fiscal year. Is it okay we slide this project back a year? And that happens. It happens every cycle.
Right.
Right.
I think that's the norm with money and budgeting, right?
But-
that something's going to come up. Yeah.
But we just need to make sure over the overall 5 years that we're within our affordability limits. We're not trying to put our costs on a credit card.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yes.
We're also fortunate too with the funding that the county has through the school construction excise tax. Jake, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so on the local side, that's a good segue. On the local side, we have 3 major funding sources that support school projects. One of them is general obligation bonds. That's really the debt affordability process where those are the projects that are revenues that are being supported by by the tax dollars
Right.
that support parks and roads and general infrastructure.
The big stuff.
But we also have this thing called Fair Share School Excise Tax Construction Bonds. These are bonds. These are also bonds that the county issues that are separate from the general obligation bonds, but these are all tied to new school projects. These bonds are in the state code for Charles County. And this is a process that started about 20 years ago, where these bonds are paid off over 10 years. So we have to make sure we can pay those over 10 years. And those are all going to new capacity. So this is for your new schools, like new elementary school, new middle school. But we also look at it if a full day kindergarten edition, that's adding capacity to the school. So therefore, it's eligible to be paid for by the Fair Share School Excise Tax.
New bodies in the seats. Is that a fair way to say it? Like a new enrollment.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have its own dedicated funding source for that. And that's on related to any brand new property in Charles County. For the first 10 years, they are assessed a Fair Share School Excise Tax. It's essentially 1/10 of the fee that it's assessed in year one, and it's paid off over 10 years, and it's part of your property tax bill. So you get on your property tax bill, you're a brand new home, you pay a property tax to Charles County, and you pay a Fair Share School Excise Tax to Charles County, and that goes in its own special revenue fund that tracks and pays for new school projects.
That makes sense. And one of the questions that I hear from community, especially when we talk about this in Citizens Academy, is like, well, what if I don't have kids? And it doesn't matter. Like that is a new property tax, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say the only thing to add to that is, as Jake mentioned, it's definitely for new schools, but it's also for renovations. So as a piece of renovation, let me clarify, because we have a coordinated discussion when we're putting projects together about how much of that renovation is new capacity, because we're always looking at how do we modernize, renovate a school, but also add to it, because we know that there is a leverage we can take advantage of with those funds by adding capacity, especially if it's in an area where it's justified. So as an example with TC Martin, that is in that eastern side of development that's happening. It's in the Bryantown area and serves sections of eastern Waldorf. So we knew that there was a need for expansion. We put in 200 additional seats. So we're able to capitalize on that excise tax funding for those additional seats. And so that's a coordinated discussion we always have, is trying to balance the money with the project as best as possible.
And it sounds like because there's rules for each kind of source of funding, how can we get the most bang for our buck? Where should we put each dollar so that we can spend it wisely?
Right. And then we have its own affordability model, because we got to make sure we can afford, there's enough cash flow coming in for the excise tax. And each year that fee is part of the budget process, and we actually when we do increases to it, is actually tied to the cost that Steve is seeing on cost of construction.
So if we know that it's really expensive right now to have school windows, that's going to have to go up because windows are really expensive.
Correct.
Okay.
And so there's in the state law, we tied the excise tax increase by the cost of school construction that's going up on the Steve side, and then every 4 years we reset the number based on the estimated cost. If the county were to build a new high school, new middle school, a new elementary school, it's based on it, and it's reset every 4 years, and then at that once it's reset, it goes up each year by the school construction costs that the IAC provides.
I just want to say I'm sitting here and again thinking that I am so glad that my job is in community engagement and not in budgeting and not in planning. So I want to just pause for a minute and say thanks for what you do, because I'm glad I don't have to do it. All right, so other stuff that you want our audience to hear.
So a couple of comments about the IAC. Jake just mentioned about their school construction cost. So what they do is every year they take a survey across the state of any new school projects, new school construction, brand new elementary, middle, high, or full replacement projects. So there's a difference between renovation and replacement, and I don't know if the public knows this, so I'll just give you the very broad. A renovation is where you basically are working within an existing building footprint.
Okay.
A replacement is where you build another school either on the same property or an adjacent property. You stay in the current school till the new one is finished. You move into the new one, you tear down the old one.
Okay.
So the state looks every year at schools that are new or replacements to determine a cost per square foot. And they adjust that value every year, and they publicize that prior to the CIP coming out. And so that is part of what feeds back to, like Jake mentioned, but it's important because it also drives what they will pay for. And so that's an important factor to make sure it is keeping pace with the cost of construction. It's always a little behind cost of construction, but there have been times where it was more significantly behind. Now it's a little behind, thankfully, with the things as they've slowed down, so it's not as big of a disparity. So that's one comment I wanted to make. Secondarily, the IAC publishes all of their documentation on the website, so you can go to the Interagency Commission on School Construction.
If you want just any light reading.
Right.
If today's episode has just made you think, you know what, I want to deep dive into this. Okay.
So they put out the CIP recommendations. They put them out in December for the based on a projection of $280 million. They offer out in December 70% of that money. 75% of that money.
Okay.
And then they project out the rest of the time frame for that 100% of funding. They did that. There's an appeal process. We did the appeal with them. We're waiting to hear what that does, but the 90% will come up in the beginning of March this year, and then 100% will be in May.
Okay.
The big change will be from that 75 to 90 if the governor changes the budget to say how much is allocated for construction. 280 is where we are right now. That's kind of the baseline. Last year, I think we were at like 435. So if it goes up, what we're eligible for, the other projects, in theory, can grow.
Could go.
So that's one other
Just
thing.
one other moving piece to add a level of complexity.
What's
there.
interesting that Steve said was May. So what happens, though, is Steve doesn't 100% know what the state's going to give him till May. Our budget typically gets approved before May. So we're using the estimates that we have at the time, but there are situations where we thought a certain school was going to get X amount, and it changed.
Yeah.
So that's when we would have to go in front of our board in July, August, or September to make changes to it based on what the state approved. So there's been situations we've done that.
Yeah, it does seem. I always laugh when it's kind of like, why haven't we just changed that? Like, why hasn't the state of Maryland just, we could make this easier, guys, but. I don't work for the state of Maryland.
Well, it's really because of the way the state legislator works. During the month of May is when when I'm saying the current Governor Moore is signing bills, which will impact funding related to.
Yep.
But the county has its own budget schedule, which is
it
is May.
complicates things.
Yes. And what's interesting though, once Steve does all his important work with getting a new school built or renovating a school, then it's up to his, other members of the school system to work with me, because I just don't work with Steve. I also work with the finance side, the fiscal side of Charles County Schools, because once the new school is built, then we work with them to determine what the cost is to operate and open that school.
Steve's job is just to get it done.
Yes.
And then somebody else has to be like, okay, now we need all of these things.
Yeah. And then they're working. So I'm working with Steve, and I'm also currently working with Karen Acton, who's the CFO for Charles County Public Schools, and we work with them to determine the cost to actually operate the school and ensure that we can afford it as well. So that's going through our process when
it's not just enough to build it; we have to be able to keep the lights on and keep it running.
Yeah.
Yep.
As we wrap up, I would love to hear from each of you either one takeaway that you want our audience to have, or one myth that you want to kind of bust about the work that you do. So what's something, Steve, you want to go first, of either something you'd love our audience to know or a myth you want to bust about your work?
So I think there'd be two things, if it's okay. Number one is just the amount of time it takes to get a project to where the doors open on a school. It is not uncommon, even on an elementary school, for it to be 6 to 7 years of time when you start the planning phases and actually start designing to where you actually open the doors. Your construction duration is generally 2 years, but that planning phase ahead of that and the state support for the planning and then the construction funding that goes along with it and all the design pieces and the permitting, it's a lengthy process.
Right.
And I don't know if everybody realizes that. And the second thing would be the way the system is structured with the requirements that we have to be over capacity. We're never going to be in a situation where there's empty seats everywhere.
Right.
Ideally, we'd like to have the ability to really balance things a little better so that the students are showing up right as the seats are available.
But that doesn't always happen.
We're doing our best to try to match those criteria. But with the requirements that are already out there, we're always behind the curve. So those would be the two things I would say.
Thank you for clarifying. All right, Jake, what do you want us to know?
I was going to say that I learned a lot today
Yeah.
for this process. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes before the school system can even put a shovel in the ground. There's a lot that goes on, but once that shovel goes in the ground, there's still a lot more work to do throughout the process to ensure that once the school is opened, there's money to go into the school to pay for the teachers and the heat, light, and power and the school buses to get
Not
there.
enough just to get it built. It's not if you build it, they will come. It's if you build it and you actually take care of it, then they can come.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
So,
And we love, just for clarification, we love those opportunities to get those shovels in the ground. We love those opportunities to get the hard hats and the pictures. Jake can support that because he
But
got
this is
in
an
the last
exciting
one.
day.
Yeah, absolutely.
in my first time ever, I got excited to wear the hat and I got to do the shovel. So
love it.
we'll have to share a picture.
I think that is a great day with both of you guys being able to get shovels in the ground for new schools and renovated schools for our amazing Charles County students. Thank you so much for being here, Steve Andritz from Charles County Public Schools and Jake Dyer from Fiscal and Administrative Services.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's Let's Get Fiscal. We talked about a lot today, and if you have questions about terms and things that came up, don't forget to go through our other episodes because we've had some great content that touched on some of these topics already. And of course, there'll be new episodes coming as well. Thanks so much, Charles County. Take care, stay safe, and stay engaged. For more information on Charles County government, visit our website, www.charlescountymd.gov. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and subscribe to the county's e-news. Also, don't forget to sign up for our text and email alerts through the Citizen Notification System. You can watch CCG TV on Comcast Channel 95 or Verizon Fios 10, and we're streaming on Apple TV and Roku devices. Just search Charles County Government. You can also subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts by searching Charles County Government. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel